Now, I want to welcome my first guest on our program. We're going to have only one guest today, but he's a remarkable man. He's Dr. Phillip Altman. Many of you will already have heard of him. He's worked for 40 years, with the Therapeutic Goods Administration on drug regulation in this country and with Big Pharma for 40 years. I'll let him give you his credentials, but I want to tell you this. Phillip is personable, engaging, caring, dedicated, and hugely competent. He's been the star of both of our inquiries so far that we've had, our cross-party parliamentary inquiries. And secondly, he's been volunteering for the last 3 years once he got to learn what's going on with COVID. Phillip has been described as a prominent former barrister, as the writer of the best legal affidavits in the country, the best he's ever seen. And he's done it not just once, not just twice, but many times, repeatedly and voluntarily. So, Phillip, welcome. And you're on the first show of Abound with Senator Malcolm Roberts.
Well, it's an honor to be on the first show. Thank you very much for the invitation.
We always start with something you appreciate. Anything, can be family, weather, time of year, friends, kids. What is something you appreciate, Dr. Altman?
Well, it's family and friends at this time. You have to keep them close. You have to look after yourselves. These are very difficult times, and it's important for everyone to keep themselves fully informed, because these really are difficult times.
I love that. So that's an understatement, isn't it? Keep ourselves fully informed. Everyone, it's our best protection.
Yeah.
Next to family and friends. So yes, I appreciate family and friends as well. I appreciate the wonderful staff I have around me as well. Thank you so much. I've got some questions about your amazing report. Could you tell us something about your technical skills, your technical details, what you've done with your life, what you've done with the last 4 or 5 decades, please, so that we can understand, because you have got enormous credibility.
Right. Okay. Well, to most people, most lay people don't understand what goes on within the pharmaceutical industry. It's a bit of a black box, and most people couldn't really relate to people like myself. But there are thousands of people like myself in Australia that look after drug regulatory affairs and clinical trials. In fact, I helped found the major educational forum for these people, which involves scientists, doctors, pharmacists, nurses, statisticians, and even members of the TGA. So there are literally thousands of people that do the work behind the scenes. And I've been in court a number of times, right, in regard to a number of cases. And the magistrates and judges seem to have a very difficult time in looking at me and deciphering what information I can offer to courts. And what I can offer is a lifetime of experience in drug development. So people like myself, their job was to keep abreast of all the international and national guidelines, standards, test procedures, methods of reporting, assessment of data, that sort of thing, for both new drugs and existing drugs, including adverse drug reaction reporting systems, things like that. So people like myself, if you've been in the business for long enough, you gain a lot of experience, and that's what I have. And especially that experience was gained as a senior consultant in the industry. I've worked for more than 50 multinational drug companies and overseas biotech companies and so forth for many years. So I can assess the quality of data, what has to be done. That's very important, because when you're developing a drug, you have to know the drug regulations. So what regulations will apply in the end of the day when you apply for marketing. So you have to be able to predict what science is required and what the standard of the science is. So that's really my strength. It is an overall view and the ability to assess when the quality of the data is adequate and when it's not.
So you've been involved with the TGA as a consultant. You've been involved with, was it 15 big pharma companies, multinationals, with drug?
More than 50.
50, sorry. 50.
More than 50.
And you've had 4 decades, and you've got a bachelor of pharmaceuticals, is it? Is that of pharmacy?
Sure. My original degree was in pharmacy. I had an honors in pharmacy, and then I did a master's of science in chemistry. And this was in the Department of Pharmacy at Sydney. And then I did a PhD in drug development, and I actually did my PhD in developing a series of cardiotonic drugs, new cardiotonic drugs, which I made in the lab, identified, and then tested in both small and large animals.
Okay, so we've got a man here with wonderful experience and incredible integrity, as you'll see pretty soon. What I want to do, Dr. Altman, is discuss the paper you co-wrote with 6 other health experts. They include a manufacturing expert who's worked with Big Pharma for, again, I think 5 decades. That's James Rowe, who understands pharmaceutical manufacturing. You also co-wrote with Wendy Hoy, who's got an Order of Australia medal, and she is a very, very highly regarded academic in medicine at the University of Queensland, well regarded across the country, well regarded internationally. You've also got Jerry Brady, who's had extensive experience as a GP and running a company in the medical industry. Astrid Leffringhausen, who's done a marvelous paper with Connie Turney on the COVID injections. Robin Cosford, who's stood up strongly and spoken out. I don't know the details about Robin. And Bruce Warhope, who's also another GP, I believe. 7 people from across the spectrum in medicine have written this paper. Where can people find it, Dr. Altman? Where can they get the paper? We will eventually be posting it, but we don't want to post it yet.
Okay, the full paper was published in Trial Site News on, I believe, the 19th of December. So you can go onto their website. It's trialsitenews.com, all one word. You have to register. It doesn't cost anything to view the paper, and you can view it there. You can also view a cut down version of that paper in the Brownstone Institute, which was published. So I've just started my own Substack. So it will be easy for me when I get around to it in a few days' time to post these online, so people can see me online at philipaltman.substack.com.
Thank you. And I want to emphasize to people who are viewing or listening on the podcast that will eventually be released of this show, Dr. Altman, that your paper cites, is based on and relies on government data, peer-reviewed papers, and highly credible, verified sources, which you'll go into, no doubt. Now, you give us a very good rundown, very concise rundown on pages 2 to 3 of your paper of the history of COVID mismanagement. And it's been gross mismanagement based on deceit, an attempt, rather than to look after people's health, an attempt to control people and to transfer money from taxpayers to big pharma. Could you give us a rundown of some of the insanities and the deceit that we've been inflicted with in the last 2 years, Dr. Altman?
Right. Well, there's been a litany of misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies. Very little of what the public has been told is really true. There was a fear campaign from the very beginning. The people associated with the promotion of the vaccines were producing modeling which was just staggering. They were predicting 150,000 deaths just in Australia in the first wave. It was just outrageous, and people were scared out of their minds. We were told that the cloth and paper masks would offer protection from infection and transmission of infection. That was wrong. We were told these new so-called COVID-19 gene-based vaccines would prevent infection, keep you out of hospital, and prevent transmission of infection. That was all wrong. We all know that's wrong now. That's indisputable. We were also told that these vaccines, in an unqualified way, we were told they were safe and efficacious, even though they were not fully approved. Now, the public doesn't understand what fully approved means or provisional approval, and many of them don't even know what provisional approval is. But none of these gene-based vaccines are fully approved anywhere. And there's a good reason for that. And the reason is the usual safety and efficacy data that's required to fully register a vaccine to show that it's safe and efficacious and meets the standards of quality has not yet been provided. And yet these claims were made to the public. To me, I believe that's criminal. Certainly, I represented a number of clients in the past in my career that overstepped the mark with their claims and had to go to Canberra to present an argument to keep them out of jail, right? In one case. And the TGA in the past could come down really heavily on people, but they let them get away with this safe and efficacious claim. And it's not supportable. So there was a litany of lies, including that it's effective and kids need it and infants need it, 5-year-olds need this vaccine. The list of lies goes on and on. We were also told that drugs like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine did not work. There was no data to support their use, and they weren't safe. And ivermectin was called toxic horse medicine. So I could go on, but we were lied to, and we continue to be lied to. And that's why I'm so active, and I try and bring the truth to people. And when I speak or when I write a report, I fully reference everything that I'm saying.
I can attest to that. I can certainly attest to that. And so can a number of barristers and lawyers.
Yeah, it's really important because this is a highly contested space, right? And who's Phillip Altman? Well, I was a retired guy. And now I'm in the fray. So when I mix it with these people, it's important that I fully document and reference exactly what I'm saying. And that's why sometimes when I give a speech, I don't give it offhand. I write my speeches out. I reference everything that I say, and it's documented for anyone to go back through any of my videos and check the references to ensure what I'm saying is correct.
So you've raised a number of really strong points, very important points. More and more people around Australia and around the world are waking up to what you're saying. I want to mention a couple of other lies too. One is that we were told lockdowns would stop COVID. They didn't. Another lie. We were also told that this thing was serious. It was really crippling disease and decimate us. I asked the chief medical officer, after failing to get documented evidence and measurable evidence from the Prime Minister and the Queensland Premier, I asked the chief medical officer and in early 2021, and he gave me a graph which showed the relative severity of COVID and the relative transmissibility compared with past flus, serious flus, and also quantified it. And just think about this, Dr. Altman. The chief medical officer, on his diagram, on his graph, showed that the severity of COVID-19 was low to moderate, not severe, low to moderate, less severe than some past flus. Highly transmissible, but no more so than some flus either. We also saw that the deaths from COVID and the flu in 2020 and 2021, we haven't got the full figures for 2022 yet, but for 2020 and 2021, the deaths from COVID plus flu, and flu was significantly greater deaths than COVID, the deaths of the two combined were less than the 7 years of the previous 7 years.
Yeah.
So this was not severe. And then if you also take into account the fact that it hit vulnerable people, those who were old, elderly people, frail people, immune systems compromised, comorbidities, etc. If you take that into account, then the severity of COVID amongst the healthy general population was very, very low. And yet, Dr. Altman and viewers and listeners, we see an increase in all-cause mortality after the vaccines were introduced. Not attributable to COVID, to something else, and no one will talk about that. You will. We've also seen a shifting of onus of proof. Onus of proof has gone from the TGA and the regulators who are supposed to protect us to the individuals who have got vaccine or injection side effects and adverse effects. And that is completely wrong. We pay these people hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to protect people, and they've transferred the accountability and the responsibility back to the people. So we've covered the history. We've given a bit of an introduction. Now your paper explains why we were given lies, why it's been such a mess, and why it's killing people. The Department of Defense, would you like to talk about the countermeasures, Dr. Altman?
Sure. So I've been looking at COVID and the treatment of COVID and the vaccines for nearly 3 years now. And there's just a mountain of data and information that is available. It seems that there's actually more lies that perpetuate the situation which you haven't mentioned, and that is the use of the PCR test.
That's not enough, is it?
No, we haven't even got to the PCR test, right? Which were not appropriate for the detection of disease, the diagnosis of disease. And that test was cranked up in sensitivity. So it was basically meaningless. The results were meaningless, but it was used to frighten a lot of people and build up the number of cases. And also, and that extended to defining who was dying with or due to COVID, right? So if you had even 1 or 2 viral particles, which meant nothing in your system, but the PCR test was positive, that was defined as a COVID positive case. So they were cranking up the numbers.
We heard of someone in Auckland, New Zealand, Dr. Altman, who was shot, murdered, right? And because he had traces of COVID in him, he was classified as a death due to COVID. I mean, that's just cruel.
Well, so the games had been played from the very beginning, and we found out about all these lies. We now know what the games are, and the mainstream news media censors all this information. That's why this show can go on.
Because let me jump in there, because some of the owners, the corporate owners of the vaccine or the injection manufacturers, are the same owners of the mouthpiece media.
Sure, exactly. The interrelationships run very, very deep. But, you know, I was constantly asked, Phil, if things are so bad, if these COVID-19 vaccines are so bad, why is the TGA not doing something about it? Why are they allowing people to die, right? And be seriously injured? There's no doubt in the world that these so-called COVID-19 vaccines have produced the highest incidence of associated death and serious adverse events than any drug in history. There's actually nothing. Claim. There's nothing in second place. There's nothing even near it in second place, and yet you will not hear that on the mainstream news media.
Nor will we hear from the TGA or TAGI or APRA or the AMA.
That's exactly right. I have a bit of a slideshow if you'd like to see that now.
Sure.
Which I can present, and then we can come back to various points. So I have a few slides here. The first slide that you see is one of my favorites, right? This shows just how insane the fear campaign got. But it is really remarkable how fear can be used as a tool. And what you said before about the comparison of the normal influenza deaths per year versus the so-called COVID-19 deaths is absolutely true. There's been a lot of work done in this area, and some work done in Australia, but the government doesn't want to refer to it.
Yet the figures I referred to came from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, a government entity.
Right. And it really looks like the COVID-19 so-called deaths, and you really can't trust the numbers of COVID deaths, because it's been estimated that most of those so-called COVID deaths aren't really COVID deaths. They're people who have died from other causes with COVID, and it didn't contribute to their death. That's another story. But it looks like COVID-19 at this point in time might have been a little bit more severe than some of the average years of influenza, by maybe a couple times or so, but it's not significant. So that's a very important point. But the estimates of the number of deaths that were touted by our so-called health experts were just enormous. Before I go on and explain to you why I say certain things, I think it's important for your viewers to understand just a little bit about how drugs are developed and how the industry arrives at a conclusion of safety and efficacy. This is a diagrammatic slide which shows most drug companies have to start with literally thousands of compounds to be screened, and sometimes they design them on the computer now and so forth. They synthesize these compounds. They test them in animals and so forth, and they eventually, if these molecules are showing some promise, and these are conventional small chemical molecules, right? I'm not talking about gene-based products here. We'll come back to that. But these are simple small molecules. And it usually takes something like 8 to 10 years to do the research. So there's drug discovery, and then you move on to preclinical, where you test the pharmacology and the absorption and so forth, the metabolism in animals. And then if you're really lucky, really, really lucky, this is a very risky thing to be involved with. This is one reason why drugs are so expensive, is that it's a highly risky business. You go into clinical trials, and I've been in clinical trials where you start in phase 1, where you take a minute quantity of the new agent and you give it to one person, a single person, in a specialized lab, highly monitored. And you have a whole number of people to analyze the results. And then they have a meeting and they go back, and if that's okay, they might give it to a second person at that same dose, that really small dose. If that goes okay, then they step it up a little bit more. And then this is how cautious the industry is. I've been there. I've worked on these trials, and it's really interesting. But it takes years to work from phase 1 with the first administration to healthy people, to move to phase 2, where you have small groups of people with the disease that you intend to treat. And that might be groups of 30 people or so. Then you do a number of those trials, and you gain experience in every stage of development. And that's how you modify how you're looking at a drug, what you look for. You gain experience every time you do a clinical trial. So it's important to do the trial, sit back and analyze the results, discuss it with your peers, with experts, and then you move on to the next phase. So then there's phase 3, which are the larger clinical trials. And they're often done with thousands of patients. Often they're international. When drug companies need to move very quickly, they often go to a CRO, a contract research organization, like my own company in Australia, to do the organizing, the legwork, the management, the reporting, the oversight, the training of the investigators, the reporting, the liaison with the TGA, and so forth. And there are literally hundreds of CROs around the world that provide a remarkable human resource to drug companies, because when they're in a hurry, they don't have time to go out and hire another 5,000 people. They need to get moving. So that's why contract research organizations are so important, and they play a fundamental role in drug development. So that's how I've gained a lot of my experience in working for 50 companies, because we contracted with a lot of companies to do this work.
So you know all the steps in this process of developing a new drug.
Sure. And then you end up with a drug file, and I was often asked to assess these drug files to make sure that the drug file contained the necessary data to a sufficient standard, in terms of scope and quality and depth, that it could be submitted. So I have a very good idea of what good quality data looks like and what bad data looks like. And I've been involved in both over the years. So that was really important. That's where I've gained my experience.
Before you leave this slide, I want to look at and ask you a brief question on the last column, post-market surveillance. You've said 8 to 10 years for the first 4 columns. The gray column on the right, that can be many, many years, can't it? I'm guessing.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I forgot to mention that because that's one of the most important segments of this slide. Because that's the adverse drug reaction reporting. So just think about it. If you spend 8 or 10 years researching a drug and you study, it depends on the case, right? Somewhere between 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, perhaps more individuals. And you're looking for safety signals. Now, in clinical trials, boy, you're really looking at safety signals. They're all recorded on literally thousands of pages of documentation or computer files, right? And any abnormal safety test, abnormal lab test is followed up. There are protocols as to how you do this. And the protocol could be 100 pages long to define what actions need to be taken if you see an abnormal effect and to follow up, or if the data is missing, or if the data doesn't make sense, right? There's all sorts of guidelines. And you can imagine that if you have a data package that contains data on, say, 10,000 patients, and you have a serious adverse event, or maybe a couple deaths that have occurred, sometimes you can't link the drug with the death, right? That's sometimes difficult to do depending on circumstances. And if you had an adverse event that caused death, or a really severe adverse event, say 1 in 5,000 or 1 in 10,000 or 2 in 10,000, you'd probably miss it. So that's why you need an efficient, transparent, and honest adverse drug reaction reporting systems that can detect adverse events that are reported by both patients and doctors following the approval of drugs. Now, in the past, that's been really efficient in terms of spotting drugs with problems. The only thing is, it takes time to build up the case, right? A lot of drugs have been withdrawn. I can get to that. I'll move on to the next slide.
So what you're saying, if I summarize for people, is that you might have in a big trial 5,000 people, maybe 10,000 people undergoing the trial with the drug. Some drugs may only have 1 in 10,000 fatality rate. You're not going to pick that up in that trial of 10,000 people. So you need, when it goes on the market, then you get many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of doses, millions of people. And if you have a few fatalities in there that's higher than normal, and you investigate and find it's due to the drug, then you withdraw that. So that's where we're going.
Yeah. Well, I've personally assembled files on 2 drugs that were withdrawn. At the time, I didn't see it. Mm-hmm. It's easy to miss. So that's why you have to have an adverse drug reaction reporting system. In terms of vaccines, there are specialized adverse event reporting systems. The vaccines should not be considered a safe group of drugs. A number of vaccines have been withdrawn due to lack of safety, with very few people showing problems. So people should not have a knee-jerk reaction that just because something is called a vaccine, it should be safe. That's a mistake.
Okay.
So just moving on. This next slide. This is interesting. This just illustrates one of the lies that was told. This is a screenshot of a US FDA press news release on the 11th of December, 2020. Okay, 11th of December, 2020. Important
Last
to
month.
note that.
A month ago.
No.
Sorry, 2 years ago.
That was before.
Oh, that's even before the vaccines were released.
That's exactly right. And if you look at what I've highlighted there, the US FDA said there's no data to show that these so-called vaccines prevent transmission of the virus. Yet, our health authorities, health experts said that they did. Well,
and correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong, but the FDA in approving an American drug, that would be highly regarded for giving provisional approval of an Australian drug by the TGA.
All right. Well, the provisional approval that we now have in Australia is a new thing. I never used it because it didn't exist. Provisional approval is a mechanism whereby, and it was introduced in 2018, and it's a mechanism whereby if there is a real need, an unmet need for an important drug, and you sit back and you consider the risks and benefits, say you had a whiz-bang new anti-cancer drug for a rare cancer and that there was no treatment. You might sit back and say, well, in these people whose life expectancy is very limited, maybe 3 or 6 months or something, and there's no treatment that's available, why not try something? So in that case, because the population's not exposed to that sort of experimental drug, you might say, let's give that drug provisional approval and on a limited basis, and let's see how it goes. And we will watch it. We'll ask for more data from the manufacturer. Now, that's what provisional approval is. There was also what's called the special access scheme, which any doctor could actually use any drug that they wanted on a one-off basis. They had to apply to Canberra, and I was involved in those too. So there were mechanisms where in isolated cases, drugs that weren't approved, weren't on the market, you could get them to people who really had very little alternative. And I thought that was probably a good idea. But that system has been abused. So I'll come back to that.
What you would have under true provisional approval is you would only give it if you had extensive, detailed, what did you say? Efficient, transparent, honest, adverse event detection and reporting. Yeah, that's not been the case. In fact, we've had a suppression of reports. But my question had two parts. The second part was that the FDA giving approval, which is not what your slide shows, but the FDA, when it gives approval, carries a lot of weight around the world for a drug company. Is that correct?
It does indeed. A lot of people do defer to the US FDA. And in the beginning, very few people knew about these mRNA breakthrough so-called vaccines. In fact, I don't think the US FDA had any great experience in this new class of drug. It's a completely new class of drug. That's important to remember too. Whenever you introduce a brand new class of drug, there are special risks attached. Most new drugs that are introduced are sort of brothers or sisters of existing drugs, and they either improve the absorption, or you have to give them less frequently during the day, or they might interact with a target receptor a bit more efficiently, have slightly fewer side effects, things like that, right? But you can predict what the adverse events are. When you have a completely new class of drug, it's a whole new game.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole new game. You have to be very careful. And these gene-based vaccines were not only a whole new game, but they were a whole new gene-based game. Now, when you introduce gene-based therapies, these are very tricky. There are special guidelines which overlayer, which go right on top of conventional guidelines for drug development. The degree of difficulty is much higher. The checking that you have to do to confirm safety is much higher. You have the potential for intergenerational effects, which can be permanent, and that has to be covered off. And that's why gene-based therapies at this point in time are reserved for usually rare, debilitating, life-threatening situations where the risk of giving these things can be argued and justified, because the alternatives don't look that good. But people weren't really told this. They were just told these were whiz-bang new vaccines that were developed in 10 months.
So I know where you're itching to go to, so I don't want to interrupt you too much, but there are two conditions there that I would assume on the gene therapy treatments. One is that they're given to a very limited number of people who have got a severe challenge medically in front of them. The alternative is certain death within a very short time. So I can see that the risk is very low, but the benefits could be that they save someone's life and keep them alive for a long time. So the benefit
Absolutely.
is high. So I get that. That's the first point. The second point is that no one would force one of these gene therapy experimental treatments on someone. It would be entirely voluntary, is my guess. And there would be enormous protocols for watching these people like hawks to report any adverse events and learn what they could from it. All of those were contradicted. Every one of them were completely contradicted, forcing people to take an experimental gene vaccine treatment across the whole population, with the Prime Minister repeatedly lying at the time that we have no vaccine mandates, when in fact he enabled them and pushed them and supported them and funded them at the state level.
Yeah. It is, to me, unconscionable. In fact, I believe it's criminal to tell people that these vaccines were approved. A lot of these courts believe they're approved. And I remember on the rare occasion that my expert reports are accepted by a court and I'm called to appear, and I've only been called to appear twice for cross-examination. People don't want to cross-examine me, right? The barrister on the other side said, Dr. Altman, don't you agree these COVID-19 vaccines have been approved by the TGA? And I said, no. And she said, no, you don't agree that they've been approved? And I said, no, I don't agree. They've been provisionally approved, and there is a huge difference. Yeah. And as soon as I uttered those words, I was dismissed from the witness stand. I mean, no one should be forced to take basically an experimental drug, much less a gene-based drug, and with the risk of losing your job and or your kids can't go to school. I mean, I'm really lost for words.
And another thing on this, I just remembered, a doctor pointed out to me just recently that under these circumstances, the TGA has a duty, I believe, I think it's legislated, we have to check that, but I think the TGA has a duty to consult the Office of Gene Therapy Regulation, and that was not done.
Yeah.
We had the TGA, who knows very little about that topic, gene-based therapies, going ahead and provisionally approving it on its own.
Yeah. They knew, I believe, next to nothing about it and relied on the evaluation reports of the US FDA, perhaps some external advice, but I believe very few people knew about these things. They were brand new, right? But I can come to that. The US Department of Defense knew about these things.
And that's the heart of this, and why they bypassed the testing procedures, why they bypassed the approval procedures, why they bypassed the manufacturing quality, etc. But you're getting to that. Okay, I'll stop interrupting.
Yeah. All right. So if I can go to my next slide, let's see if that's going to come up. Okay. So this is important because this just shows you, this is data from New South Wales that shows that the people who are unvaccinated aren't in hospital and aren't in ICUs, but the people who are fully vaccinated, and in fact, the more they're vaccinated and boosted, the more people are in hospital and ICUs. It's just remarkable. They're actually stopping because this data looks so bad in terms of the narrative that the government wants to sell. In future, we've been notified that no longer will they be reporting the numbers of unvaccinated versus vaccinated in hospital and ICU. So this is the type of games that are being played, and that's why there's so little trust in the system now. These people have misled us, have provided us with disinformation, and have caused so much damage up to this point in time. And they haven't learned their lesson. They're continuing on. It's as if they can't admit their mistakes, and it really is sad. My next slide. So in the US, there's, and I mentioned this before, there is a specialized vaccine adverse event reporting system that catches, well, mainly the US reports. It's about, I believe, about 60%, maybe 65% of all the reports are from US citizens or doctors. The other third is from overseas. But this just illustrates the statement that I made before. This shows that there have been 33,469 deaths reported and associated with the COVID-19 vaccines as of the 30th of December, 2022. Now, when you're reading that number, you really have to take into consideration the fact that there is an acknowledgement of underreporting. That is, doctors are hesitant to admit that they've prescribed the vaccine and someone died as a result. they're loath to do that, or a serious adverse event, or they're frightened to report an adverse event, or it's too hard. Sometimes when you try and report these things, it can take an hour to report these things, and often you're not even talking to a human voice at the other end, and there's forms to fill out. The doctors are busy. There's all sorts of reasons why there's underreporting. Now, the best underreporting estimate that I have seen, and I've seen a lot of them, run to about 40 times. Some people say it's up to 100 times. I personally think it's higher than 40. I think it's closer to 100. But say if it's even 40 times, you take the number 40 and you multiply it by 33,469.
1.2 million.
Exactly. So that's 1.2 million deaths associated with the vaccines. Now, okay, now, not all these deaths would be due to the vaccine. You might say, okay, someone might have fallen off a building or something like that. In fact, I heard the head of the TGA say, people die all the time. They fall under a bus and get hit by cars and stuff. But doctors don't report a death associated with a COVID-19 vaccine of a person who's left their office and got run over by a bus.
No. And you look at that and you see 33,000 deaths, maybe 40 times that, which is 1.2 million, and 62,000 permanently disabled. That's 2.4 million, about 2.5 million. That's stunning. Anaphylaxis, people can die from that. Look at the myocarditis and pericarditis plus heart attacks. Hell, look at the number of miscarriages.
Well, the underreporting is amazing. Just I have on my other screen here. You'll recall that the health authorities constantly say myocarditis in adolescents and kids is extremely rare. They don't say what extremely rare means, but they say it's extremely rare. Well, if it's not reported, it's going to be extremely rare, right? But if you do a proper study and you design it correctly, and you have sensitive biomarkers to detect heart damage in kids, you might find that the results are different. And in fact, such a prospective study was done in Thailand, with over 300 kids. And they gave COVID-19 vaccines. And they followed them up prospectively. So this isn't relying on someone being injected and going away and reporting an adverse drug event, right? These are kids who, after they're injected, are subjected to intense safety scrutiny. And what they found, the main officer, the investigator was Mansangwan, Mansanguan. Anyone can look that up. And you will find that these investigators report 18% of kids injected with COVID-19 so-called gene-based vaccines had cardiovascular issues, heart issues. 18%. And I'm just reading from my notes, 3.5% had evidence of myocarditis or pericarditis. Now, that didn't have to be clinical myocarditis or pericarditis. That is clinical signs of chest pain and so forth. But these were detected by markers that defined whether a person had myocarditis or pericarditis. 3.5%. 3.5% is not rare in my book.
And it also says in that paper, you sent me notes a couple of days ago, the paper noted that cardiovascular effects were found in 29.24% of patients ranging from tachycardia, palpitation, and myo or pericarditis, almost 30% of the cases. Boy, that's not rare.
It's not rare.
That's troubling.
Now, there are standards that I've been used to, and all these standards have been broken. All the definitions have been broken. For example, in the Australian Adverse Drug Reaction Reporting System, the DAEN system, which I look at constantly, the Australian TGA refused to admit that there's been a single death due to an adolescent or child. Not a single death. We know that's not true. That is proof the system is broken. Okay.
Well, I've asked the TGA the question, Dr. Altman, show me what process you take to go from almost 1,000 doctor-reported deaths and you whittle it down to 14. And their process is not defined. It's very loose. It's highly subjective.
Okay. You don't know who's doing it.
No.
You don't know what their connections are.
No.
You don't know who's paying their salaries, directly or indirectly.
No.
You don't know what grants they've got.
No.
You don't know what drug companies they've worked for or are working for. You don't know anything about it. This is all done in secret. We don't know what the criteria for assessment is. Normally for assessment, when you're assessing adverse drug reactions, you assess them as definite, probable, possible, possibly related, or unlikely to be related, right? The TGA doesn't use those terms. They use the term linked, which I guess in legal terms gets them off the hook because they know they're in deep.
Right, and I asked the head of the Therapeutic Goods Administration, Dr. Skerritt, Professor Skerritt, for the process. He said it under notice. A question on notice. He said it had come. Next Senate estimates, it hadn't arrived. I asked for it again. Oh, it had been sent. No, it hasn't been sent. Well, we'll send it again. Wasn't sent. Next time around, we asked him again, and he said he would send it, and it was just a piece of highly subjective, very vague, exactly as you just said.
Malcolm, you have zoomed in, you have focused in on the problem. It's the adverse drug reaction reporting system that the TGA relies upon to claim safety. They rely on this system, and yet it's a secret system. Now, the most important point that I've made in various presentations that I've made is simply this. It's a concept that's simple to understand. And that is that if you have a provisional approval system that allows drugs to just skate through the normal regulatory system with a minimum of safety and efficacy and quality data, and at the same time, you have a broken adverse drug reaction reporting system, we are not safe. Because they're using that broken system to claim safety. And safety was not proven under the limited clinical trial testing under provisional approval. You cannot have, in my view, a provisional approval system while you have a broken adverse drug reaction reporting system. You either fix the adverse drug reaction reporting system, or if you can't do that, you have to get rid of the provisional approval system.
Right. And then you add in this country, APRA and the TGA focusing on doctors, pushing doctors to not report. That's something else on top of that again. So we've got something that has caused all of this to happen. All of the bypassing of the normal procedures. What is that?
Okay.
Or when you're ready for it.
This
This
is
is all
pretty big.
explainable.
This
And
is
you told
well,
me,
it wasn't explainable to me a month ago.
no, but when I saw this, it explained everything. Well,
All
almost
right.
everything.
Okay. So to give credit where credit is due, and credit is due here. There were three remarkable ladies who have uncovered the legislation and the regulations which explain everything that we've seen. Because what I was seeing was unbelievable. That slide I just put up, the adverse drug reactions, the VAERS system, if only 1% of those reports occurred with any other new drug, it would have been withdrawn the very next day.
Yep.
It has not been. The news regarding these vaccines is not good. It is getting worse by the day. Their efficacy is waning, yet the toxicity remains. And people would ask me, how do you explain this? And I could not explain it up until a month ago. Now, there are three ladies, Whitney Webb, and people can go search that name, Catherine Watt, and Sasha Latipova.
Yep.
And I've been speaking with Sasha in recent times. And I'm speaking with her in particular because she is a past owner of a CRO, a contract research organization like myself. And she's worked for 60 companies. And Pfizer were investors in her company. Her company was mammoth, I mean, much bigger than my company. Highly experienced, this lady. She's brilliant.
Well, they're switched on. I watched an interview that you sent me from Christine Dolan of Sasha Latipova and Catherine Watt, and wow, was that impressive.
Yeah,
These are two impressive women. Two impressive humans.
They are. So I and my colleagues got together and we thought, rather than doing a video, we'll write a paper. And that's the paper that you have, Malcolm.
It's a hell of a paper.
And we publish that. Now, what does that paper say? Maybe we can go on to another slide. Let's see if that works. Okay, now just before we get there, this is just explaining a little bit about what it takes to withdraw a drug. And if you look at the history of pharmaceuticals, it doesn't take much. As few as 100 cases of death, or even less in the case of some vaccines, they were withdrawn. The case of the COVID-19 vaccines is orders of magnitude higher. I've been involved in drug withdrawals. I mean, what I'm seeing it is completely unprecedented. That word has been abused in recent times, but in this case, it's very appropriate. Completely unprecedented. So let me just go on. I will come back to this slide. Let me go to the. This is the slide that I want. So Sasha and others have been discussing the background to the development of the COVID-19 gene-based vaccines. The image that the authorities and the TGA and the media want us to have is that COVID-19 came about and the really bright sparks within Pfizer and Moderna went away, and they came up with a fabulous idea for a new type of vaccine, a gene-based vaccine, although they didn't call it that. based on mRNA. And that within 10 months, they had done all the research and taken it to the US FDA. And the US FDA said, gee whiz, this is looking good. We've looked at all the data, and we're going to give it emergency use authorization, which is not identical, but similar to the provisional type of approval system that we have here, right? But there are special conditions.
Excuse me, Dr. Altman. The recording is scheduled to finish in 10 minutes. So
okay, I will speed up. So there's legislation in place that goes back 20 years that allows the U.S. Department of Defense to take command and control over the development of countermeasures. They aren't even called pharmaceuticals, and they're called countermeasures. These COVID-19 vaccines, so-called vaccines, are not pharmaceuticals, according to the U.S. Department of Defense, who owns them. They are countermeasures, and they were developed under the guidance of the U.S. Department of Defense, and this is why the normal safety standards did not have to be done. This is why the normal approval was not required by the U.S. FDA. It was all kabuki theater. They want you to believe.
So the vaccine manufacturers, were they contracted to the Department of Defense?
That's right. They were subcontractors.
And the FDA
there were lots of companies that were directed under the direct control. And the U.S. Department of Defense has its own facilities. I'll go to another slide. This is a slide that's been declassified. That is just one of a group of slides that was presented to the U.S. FDA in October 2020. If you look on the right-hand side, the chief operating officer of Operation Warp Speed was, guess who? The U.S. Department of Defense. They controlled everything. And they control everything under secret contracts. There's no liability by drug companies or anyone involved in approving these drugs. They're all protected under special legislation. Sasha has explained all this multiple times on the net, and people should go and chase her up. So this explains why there have been so many problems with these vaccines. They weren't developed in the normal way. A normal drug company would not take these risks. No way would they take these risks, but the Department of Defense would, because they are impervious to litigation. You can't sue them. There's no liability. There's no accountability. The contracts are secret, and there's tons of money. And this is just an example of the spend in 1 year, $47.5 billion by BARDA, one arm of the U.S. Department of Defense. These are big players.
BARDA is Biomedical Advanced Research Authority
and Development Authority, yeah.
And Development Authority. So that's a part of the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
And it can spend $47.5 billion on these toxins with no scrutiny or accountability, and the contracts all secret.
Yeah. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is, if you care to look for it, it's in plain sight. Here's part of a presentation that was made to the US FDA. It's not a conspiracy theory. Anyone who doubts this just has to think for a moment. Why are these drugs so questionable in terms of safety? The reason is the usual safety tests have not been done because the US Department of Defense didn't need to do them.
Let's make sure, rather than rush this, Dr. Altman, let's go as far as we can in the next 5 minutes, then stop and see if we can arrange for the finishing of it subsequently, because I don't want to rush this. This is very, very important. It's highly significant.
Sure. I'm prepared to spend as much time as you like.
Okay, thank you.
So this is just a screenshot of the cut down version of the Trial Site News publication that describes the involvement of the U.S. Department of Defense. And it's very heavily referenced. That's everything I do. So anyone that doubts anything that's said in the article, I think there's 20 or 30 references at the back of the paper. Just take some time and just have a bit of a look, and you can see for yourself that this is not a conspiracy theory.
Okay. So we've got the COVID injections with a huge number of adverse events, fatalities, deaths. Underreported though it is, it's still huge, and nothing's done about it because nothing can be done about it. Yeah.
And people are still promoting it. I had a slide up there of one of the chief architects of the vaccine mandate policy. That's Jane Halton.
Oh, yeah.
And she was the chief advisor to Scott Morrison. She's, although she has a long history as a bureaucrat in the health department here in Australia, she's been overseas, very close relationship to Bill Gates. And, but I mean, she has a Bachelor of Arts, and I don't really think that we should be relying on her recommendations to implement the forced administration of serious gene-based experimental COVID-19 therapies to kids or anyone else.
Well, I recently wrote to Mark Butler, the Labor government's current health minister, questioning his appointment of Jane Altman to review the, I think it was the vaccine contracts. Because I said there seems to be a conflict of interest here, given her past associations, her current associations,
absolutely.
her involvement.
The conflicts.
He wrote back, nothing to see here. Nothing to see.
The conflicts. This is the problem. The conflicts of interest are everywhere, and if people aren't honest, we're not going to solve this problem. Not only are we not going to solve this problem, but it's going to happen again, and people need to be informed. So thank you very much for taking the trouble to do this sort of detailed deep dive into the real issues.
Well, it's really important that we have a royal commission to get to the basis, bottom of all of this. But before that, a Senate select inquiry to narrow down the terms of reference for the Royal Commission and to really focus on it and make it objective. That's absolutely critical. Otherwise, we will repeat it. But what you're saying here is another point I think you gave me in a conversation earlier, is that good manufacturing processes were also bypassed.
Absolutely.
And that's why some what is it, batches as they're called of this toxin will kill people, and other batches like having saline. Well, we've got a minute to go, Dr. Altman, so we're going to have to wrap it up. But I'll see if we can make arrangements to continue this, because we've got a number of other points to go through, and maybe we can splice the two videos together. Thank you very much for what you're doing. Thank you so much for preparing it, and thank you for taking us through logically, slowly, carefully, as you always do, very methodically and with complete integrity and competence. So thank you so much, and stick around. We'll see what we can do about extending this.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Altman.